what was life like before the neoliberal era, before the end of the 1970s? You know, Margaret Thatcher got into power in the late 70s. She then dismantled the commanding heights and handed them across to private companies to siphon off a profit, to deregulate, and to basically rip the profits generated by workers into fat cat shareholder salaries and out of the public purse. What has happened? What was life like though before we had mass privatisation? Because after World War II, we did have a nationalised programme. Many industries were nationalised, were owned by the public. They weren't necessarily completely democratic, but they were better than what we had now. And we had much of our natural resources, British Petroleum, British Gas, the Electricity Board, British Shipbuilding, we had Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, British Airways, British Rail. Most of our transport was publicly owned. Major bit British Telecom. Now most of our society is privatised, and we live with the disastrous consequences of that privatisation. But most people, before 1970, unionisation was strong. It was far, far higher than now, proportionally. Wages matched with productivity, so as we increased productivity, as workers produced more, the wages increased. Now, since the 1980s in both America and in Britain, probably in the Western world in general, there's been a decoupling of wages increasing at the same rate as productivity has increased. I think in America, in the past 40 years or so, productivity has increased 3.5 times as much as pay. That's in America. In Britain, it'll be something somewhat similar. It's an absolute disaster. It's a disaster, and there's many reasons why it is, and we know why. The lack of unions in the private sector. Only a few percent of British workers, I think it's between 10 and 15%, in the private sector are unionised. Now that's insane. You should be under a collective agreement where possible. You should be in a union for many different reasons, but you should definitely get collective bargaining, which means that basically there's various ways to do it. You can get statutory collective bargaining if you meet the conditions, and by the way, the conditions are a total disgrace. The conditions have been changed, I think, by New Labour and Tories that have made it harder to get collective bargaining. You should be able to get collective bargaining just with a few employees, but it's difficult. There's difficult conditions, but you can get the union's lawyers to send a letter asking for collective bargaining, and ultimately, if you can do that, you should do that, because you should collective agreements. You're stronger together. You will negotiate with the union, negotiates with you on your behalf with the employer, under this system called capitalism, where we separate the control of companies from workers, which, as I've said, is a total disgrace. But that's what occurs under capitalism. And unionisation has gone down. Unionisation is one lever of democracy in work. The small lever that it is, it's one lever. And in Britain, we don't have workers' councils, we don't have workers' assemblies in companies, we don't have workers sit on boards. It's just basically wage slavery, other than the small democracy that we get in the fact that we have legislation from government that regulates some businesses, and we have some bodies that regulate it, and we also have unions where they exist, but they're weakened, and they're not enough people are a member of them. And unions have in many ways, they've capitulated to bosses. They've sold workers out in many ways. Unite did it a few days ago to Heinz workers in Wigan. So well, unions are not perfect, and the system of having unions and bosses, isn't, and work having a distinction and all that is not perfect at all. It's not workplace democracy. Of course, it's not. I would like to see workers directly in control in every workplace, electing management, voting for policies, participating together on an equal footing, and not having external shareholders. I would love to see that, having everything a cooperative initially, and then move the society ideally to a largely planned economy. But ultimately, right now, it's so far removed from what I would say is a communist or socialist society that it's madness. I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, a large proportion of workers would have been unionised. Pay increased with productivity largely. We had good levels of employment. The commanding heights at the time, like British Steel, like British Petroleum, British Gas, the coal board, the electricity board, all those things were state owned and state run. However, qualification, they were not completely state run. I mean, the minister in government would have elected the board, I believe, and would have had some control over them, but it was arm's length. It was not true control by government, by the representatives in government. And the planning and so forth, and the pricing, there was a lot of controversy around that. How much profit should they make? Should they make a profit? Should it be marginal cost? Should they be selling the goods at marginal cost? There was all them kind of things basically, but it was not run through a system of councils as I would personally want it to run, completely democratically, by workers electing management and sending delegates to higher councils and having citizens and trade union representatives sit on these councils to determine the prices and to determine what we want produced and so forth, and the policies. It wasn't like that. But it was still better than the privatised disasters that we have now. And we didn't have a massive financialised economy. Now the major banks, the major financial institutions, and of course the major tech institutions like Microsoft, Amazon and all them types of companies, they are also now the commanding heights, and of course Virgin, and of course Sky, and all them types of companies. They are now where the main economic activity is in Britain, as opposed to the manufacturing elements that have been sold off, and we are no longer global manufacturers for certain stuff. That's not to say British Aerospace and British Airways. We used to have British Airways. The fact is, these industries were nationalised, and we did not have millions and millions of private companies in Britain like we do now. We didn't have a massive, overwhelming private sector like we do now. Since the 1980s, that's all exploded, and manufacturing has decreased, unionisation has decreased, and with that, whatever element of democracy at work has also decreased, because that's one of the only mechanisms we have in Britain for democracy at work. And we have worse services and less investment, and we're not in control of the commanding heights anymore. We're not. To the extent we was then, to the limited extent we was then, it was a lot better, and the profits that are generated by the workers in these commanding industries, these strategically important industries that are fundamental to society, like the natural resources, like the railway, the energy networks and so forth, public utilities. The profits, instead of going back into the system to be reinvested for the public good, for the general interest, they are siphoned off into fat cat shareholder profits and dividends. That's insane. To think that could possibly be happening in things like the privatisation of water. I mean, how many water companies are gonna? How much does it cost to set up a new water company in Britain, and to compete by putting water pipes in, or that's why these markets, like the energy markets, They're a completely fake market. They're not really in competition. It's their natural monopolies. They are by design natural monopolies, and it's difficult for competitors to exist. And where that is true, that absolutely should be a nationalised industry under the system we live under now. That should 100% be nationalised. I mean, there can't be competition. We're just basically giving the profits away to a private company to pay their dividend shareholders and bosses. That is insane. We should be in control. We should be setting a plan together with our representatives in government. We should be deciding what the plan is as part of our being a citizen, and we should be deciding what we want, how these companies are run, how these industries are run, which should be under a form of public ownership. But life was, in many ways, much more fairer and equal. We had railways that worked. We didn't have the technological innovation that we have today. Obviously we don't. But and I can do a video on where technological innovation is coming from. And guess what? It's not just coming from the private sector. That's total BS. You can open up your smartphone. This is a Samsung S21 Ultra. Okay, that's one of their flagship models, and I do like a good phone. I do like a good phone because they're useful. I use all the apps like Google Maps and all that. But a lot of the technology in that phone came from the state sector in America, which was paid for by the American public through things like the military budget, which is just a total lie. I mean, don't get me wrong, the military budget goes towards the military, but it also goes towards paying for the high-tech economy. But you're not told about that, but that is the truth. So a lot of the internet, a lot of computers, technology, we handed them over to IBM, we handed them over to Microsoft after years of development in the public sector, which still continues, by the way. So the idea that we need this market economy to keep, innovation and all that is total BS. It's not true. That's not to say that I'm completely and absolutely. I mean, I'm not necessarily. I think it's an open question. The extent to which we would require a market economy for some types of things. I mean, a market economy has disastrous consequences. So in my opinion, for externalities on the environment, externalities in all aspects of it, and I think that fundamentally a planned society would have to come about in some way. But maybe it would permit, for some goods, it would some luxury goods, maybe they'd be permitted in some type of fake market, if you will, that significantly did not have severe externalities like we have under our society now, where if we carry on capitalism, if we carry on fast fashion and ripping up fossil fuels and burning through energy and building everything and not having a largely planned society, then in the next century or so, the temperature is going to rise probably about 3 to 4 degrees, and if that happens, large swathes of the earth will not be habitable, will not produce arable land, will not produce food and so forth, and so we will have global war, because it will cause war with decreasing areas of land to use, will cause a competition even more for resources, and it'll be an absolute disaster. So if we carry on this precipice of a market economy and letting consumers that have been totally brainwashed into believing they need the latest Nike or whatever, or Gucci handbag or whatever, then we are going to kill ourselves through global warming, essentially, through climate change. Now, I think that's what scientists have told us, and another key factor in climate change, another key factor is consumption of animal foods, and that's something that all humans need to realise, is that in your natural state you don't require animal foods in any significant capacity. The only capacity you require them for is vitamin B12, which is a bacteria that you would have taken in the water or on the surface of food in your natural state thousands of years ago, without the requirement to consume dairy or animal meat, the flesh of animals, that's full of cholesterol, that's full of growth hormones, that's full of cancerous properties, that's full of animal protein, that causes an immediate immune response that you can measure in the blood when you eat a high cholesterol, high animal-based food. And cholesterol is only found in any significant quantity in animal flesh and animal tissue. So you don't require animal foods, but animal foods is the consumption of animals and factory farming and everything that goes with it, feeding the animals, the water to give the animals, causes around 50% of global emissions. So you can see where that is a crucial one. It's not just the fast fashion and the burning of fossil fuels for energy and everything else that we do. Of course, we need to move to a wind, hydroelectric, renewable solar energy economy. Of course we do. Now the Tories will never do that, but that's what we need to do, and keep fossil fuels in the ground. But it's not just the fossil fuels in the ground. It is animal farming as well that is all to do with it. So we need to stop consuming animals. That's another crucial part. But I've gone off the thingy a bit now, because what I'm saying is that in the 1960s and 70s, there was not this massive financialisation of the economy. It was a manufacturing sector, a large manufacturing sector economy. British Steel was a massive, powerful company. Now it's obviously just it's owned by Tata Steel, an Indian company, and we permit Indian companies to own our, what I would class as our crucial manufacturing industry, and to permit that, to permit our steel industry to be owned by a foreign company, to be sold off. I think it was sold off 20 odd years ago. It was technically sold off recently, but I think it had already kind of been sold off in many ways. But ultimately, it should be nationalised. Of course, it should be. Steel, if we're going to build stuff, we need steel. It's a fundamental property that we use. It's a fundamental product, and we had a great steel industry that has been ruined by Thatcher and Labour, and that's why New Labour have in no way, they've accelerated the selling off of the commanded heights. That, don't think of Labour as a socialist party. I mean, maybe under Corbyn it was more socialist, but under Tony Blair it was a capitalist party. It was a capitalist party. It was pro-privatisation, pro-finance. But what we have now, we have industries that have been privatised that basically don't work. We have massive increase in bills. We trying to get through to a private company, whether it's a bank, whether it's a supermarket, whether it's an energy company, to talk about a bill is a total disaster. Their interest is profit motive. Their interest is not, well, is this right for what we need? Is this right for our democratic plan? Is this right for the environment? It's not the general interest. They care about the profit motive, and so the consequences of 40 years of neoliberalism and the selling off of what you might call the commanding heights, although nowadays the commanding heights, as I said, includes other companies like big tech giants, big internet companies, big banks, and other companies that were not, and certain media companies certainly, like Sky and Virgin, that were never previously part of what you might call the commanding heights, but now definitely they would be a part of it. It's where the major economic activity occurs, and they have massive control and influence over the British public, and so the consequences has been nothing short of an absolute disaster. Any socialist or communist programme must immediately take back some of these industries. Over the part of a few years, ideally it would take over the biggest companies in Britain. It would take over the industries. It would bring them all completely in-house, get rid of all the senior management. It would run them through a system of councils, democratic councils. It would be subject to citizen, worker, trade union input, and we would run them in the general interest, and we'd come up with a plan. Now, but fundamentally, that can only happen when we gain democratic control. Having them privatised prevents true control, because their interest is the profit motive, not the general interest.